Hello, welcome to my virtual classroom. My name is Brenna Elwell, and I'm a 5th grade teacher in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I am in my 3rd year of teaching. I teach math, science, and language arts. For these activities, I chose to integrate science. These activities were all online as we are in remote learning. 3 5th graders participated in these online activities, and I decided to use embedded Google Slides in Google Classroom. I chose my platform based on what my students were familiar with. These slides allowed teacher instruction, video responses, and readings. These interactive Google Slides were a way for students to engage in the content virtually. We started with our learning targets and quickly moved into looking at the different perspectives we can take. This was the first time my students have looked at this image, and so I quickly read off the different perspectives, but really talked about the definition and questions we might ask ourselves, thinking from a historical and ecological point of view, as they were the ones I wanted students to focus on. I was impressed with how students were able to use these different perspectives during the thinking routines. Students started each lesson with a thinking routine called Connect, Expand, Challenge. This activity is done after watching a video. I always try to start a lesson by getting students thinking about related knowledge they already have. For this thinking routine, it starts by having students write down connections from what they saw in the video to past experiences or units of learning. They then expand by writing how their knowledge has grown on the topic. Lastly, they write down questions of things that are still challenging them. For this thinking routine, students watched a video that shows scientists researching and collecting data to see at what rate the glaciers are melting. They used repeated photography to help them. They talked about how the rate of glacial melting has affected the organisms living in the surrounding ecosystems through their food webs. What made me so excited when reading these is seeing that there is a deeper thinking happening when students are challenged to look from different perspectives. It extended their thinking during each part of the lesson. This first connection, the students not only created connections, but identified that it was from an ecological perspective because they had to do with the environment, and the video said that the glaciers were melting due to climate change, which is the human's fault. So this student also gives an example from the video to back up the connection. It was really cool to see the student expanded on their thinking and thought from both perspectives. This student wrote, I had already knew that glaciers were disappearing, but I didn't know they were disappearing that fast. She wrote, I think that both historical and ecological perspectives were involved because it talks about how the warmer temperatures could affect the animal's food source. Also, it talks about the glaciers disappearing. This student knew that we can think about this over time, but also think about how it affects the ecosystem. When students moved on to challenge, they had to think about what questions they had and how they related to a historical or ecological perspective. Here you can see the student wrote 2 questions, one that was historical and one that was ecological. The first question the student identified as historical, they wrote, when did we start to see drastic changes in the glaciers? They also questioned, what are we going to do to help the glaciers? This one was identified as ecological. The next part of the lesson was for students to read a climate change encyclopedia entry from the National Geographic Library online. This entry allowed students to explore how humans impact the natural world through fracking. This was at a global scale as students were learning about an issue happening around the world. Students learned that humans everywhere are impacting the world and creating climate change. Climate change is then creating glacial melting at a fast rate, which impacts living things. What are different cause and effect relationships between human actions on the ecosystem? How do we know? What do you predict will happen if we don't do anything about it? These questions challenge students to explore cause and effect relationships between human impact on the earth. Each student was able to make the connection between human actions with fracking and climate change, which has caused glacial melting. One student even made the connection that if we don't do anything, this may go further than not having glaciers, but species going extinct. One student says, the cause of human impact is that they are extracting natural gas and petroleum, which then releases carbon emissions, and that is linked to global warming and climate change. I think that if people don't stop, then we might not have any glaciers. The most exciting part for me is during Activity 2 when students go to the World Wildlife Fund, where they learn about how we can reduce our carbon footprint, and they actually made a pledge through this organization and then wrote to me explaining the pledge they made. Some of the pledges were to only buy what they need at a grocery store, ride their bike more, and recycle. In the future, I hope to have these activities lead into a service project that connects to renewable resources in our local community. In my area and many areas of the world, we are all learning how to navigate at-home learning, and I am so grateful for this course in helping me to develop meaningful work during remote learning.